everyone, welcome back to my channel. I have just completed this autumn scene that I've painted for you all. So if you'd like to check that out, grab your paintbrush and let's go paint. I'm just trying to establish the image that is in my head and trying to get it down on the canvas as quick as possible. And this is called the blocking in phase. I'm just trying to establish some rough ideas of the values I'm going to use. One of the things I do really love about oil painting is at any time during any of these steps, if something isn't panning out, if something isn't working the way you wanted it to or the way it looked in your head, you can change anything, whether it's color or the shape of the road or the shape of a tree. As long as you can see what's going wrong in the painting, you can change it. That's actually something that can be hard to teach yourself, but in the long run will definitely help improve your art. Is if you can be your own critic and find out what part of the painting isn't working and how to change it. I'm just going to continue to fill this in with the idea that I have in my head. So now that I have everything filled in and I can sort of see where this painting is gonna go from here, my values are roughly very kind of close to where I need them to be. So right now that all of the colors are established in the background, all I pretty much have to do is just add in all the little details. And working with this tree in the back, when trees start to change their colors, there's a lot of different colors going on and happening within that tree. So I want to make sure that I put the light color on, that the sun is shining on the back half of it. So you're going to see all those bright yellow colors. And then I added the orange for the mid-tone, and I'll play back and forth, but because these are all with oils, I do have to let them dry. So I just do a little at a time, and that's why I'm skipping around to different trees and just doing certain colors, stopping, and then working with another tree instead of finishing out that tree altogether. There's only so far I could go before I have to stop completely and wait for the next day, because I do add liquid original into my paints, so my painting is pretty much dry within 24 hours. And here I'm going in and adding in that light that I talked about before. And I'm adding in a little bit more branches. I don't think you could ever really overdo twigs and branches, especially when you're working with a forest scene like this. Establishing all those little twigs down at the bottom, so these leaves right here in the foreground kind of have a base. You kind of figure out where they're coming from, because this hill is going to continue to slope downward on the left hand side. And Arkansas has a lot of natural stone. So that is what I'm adding right here along the right hand side of the painting. All these dark little spots are natural stones. And I'll come back in a little later and add in the highlights to those rocks and make them really stand out. So all the light is coming from that top right corner of the painting. And so right now I am adding in all of the leaves, and I slowed it down so you can see my brush work and how I go about doing this. And it is honestly just a ton of little dots laid on top of each other. And I took that idea from printing and the computer and the TV. You know, everything is pixelated. So the more dots you have, the more it seems realistic. So I try and add a lot of little tiny dots to my painting to make it establish the color that I'm trying to go for and the realism that I'm trying to go for. So I really just do 4 or 5 little dots and then refill my brush, because right now I'm using a number 1 round synthetic brush, so it only holds so much paint. And the closer you get to the foreground, the bigger the leaves become, so you have to keep that in mind as well. I'm adding some highlights because the sun is going to be shining through the trees at some point. I'm just adding a little bit of gray to my burnt umber, and that's what's creating that mix. And I just adjust the values. I'll add a little bit more titanium white or a little bit more burnt umber to adjust the colors of where it lies on this dirt road. You can't forget the shadows. The leaves are going to build up on the right hand side of the road, and it's going to create a little shadow there. So we can't forget to add the shadows. And to show that this slopes downward, it's going to gradually get darker on the left hand side. So there's a little spot right here that the sun is going to be shining through, so I'm just establishing the highlights right now. And I always start with the highlights and then add in my shadows, because if I do it the opposite way, it's hard. It always seems harder for me to place the highlights on top of the shadows. And again, with these leaves, just a million little dots. Every single time I do a new color, I'll just add a few dots here and there, and I'll just slowly add the texture and the depth to all these leaves. Right now I'm using a little liner brush to just get tiny little leaves and the shadows that are in between the leaves done. Adding a little bit more twigs and branches. And as I said before, I bounce around the painting a lot, because when I start to get too much paint accumulated in a certain area, I have to wait for that paint to dry before I can start adding more layers on top. So when I'm finished with a certain area, like I was with the leaves, although that area isn't complete, I move on to the next area to let that certain part of the painting dry before I go back to it. If I keep adding paint on top of what I already have, it's going to start to blend together and mix, and it will eventually look like mud. which is something I really am trying to avoid. So I zoomed into this part so you can again see all the details that I get within this tree. And because this is the foreground, I am adding a lot more detail than I would distant trees. So I'm really actually doing all of the little leaves that are going on this tree. And I'm going to go back and forth between making little small ones to bigger ones. And I do that because you're going to be able to see through the branches and through the trees, and some leaves you can only see half or a little bit of, and so that's why I try and add a lot of little details, so when you are able to see through those branches, it still looks like you're seeing leaves behind the bigger leaves. So I really pay attention to where I add the leaves. Because the sun is coming from the upper right hand corner, these leaves are going to be brighter than the color that I laid down previously. So I'm trying to just keep in mind that the sun is going to hit the top part of this tree. So I'm just trying to add the leaves to the top half of the tree, and it's going to start to shape what the tree is going to look like. And the further back the tree goes also, a little bit darker it's going to get. There's not going to be so many highlights as they have on the tips of the tree right over the road. So keep that in mind as well. Just going to speed it up to get it done a little quicker. Again, I'm still working with the #1 round synthetic brush. It's a Taklon bristled brush. There's a lot of different colors throughout these trees, so I'm just adding multiple colors, different variations here and there. Working on this tree right here, I am just adding the base colors, keeping it light because the sun is shining from behind it. So again, I add light colors, establish the tree shape, and then I go in and I add in the dark colors, and then I'll go back in and add the light colors over top of that again and establish where all the twigs are more and more. Now that I can see where the trees are forming, I went back and I added some highlights on the road. So here I'm adding in a lot more twigs. And I don't feel like you can add too many twigs when it comes to a forest scene like this. There are millions, and I know you won't be able to paint them all, so just try and get the main ones. But the more twigs that you add that you can see through the trees and through the leaves, the more realism I feel that you bring to the painting. especially in an autumn scene where the trees are losing a lot of their leaves, you're going to see a lot of branches and bare limbs, or bare twigs. And I am really trying to keep my hand out of the way, but the best way to do twigs is start from the base and wiggle your way up to the tip of the twig, and the further up you go, the lighter amount of pressure that you do. And the easiest way to do that is to have my hand going up, and so it just gets in the camera's way. So I apologize for that. And on the forest floor, there are a lot of little tiny trees trying to grow. So don't forget that. You're going to have really tall, big, mature trees that have been there for 50 plus years, but you're also going to have the little tiny guys at the bottom of the forest floor that are going to try to grow, and that will probably eventually replace the mature ones once they fall from Mother Nature. So I'm just adding more to that tree right there, so the leaves have some place to hold on to. They're not just floating out in the middle of nowhere. And to save some time always going back to my palette, I get a bunch of the twig color and the branch color on my knife, and my palette knife, which I hold right next to me. And when I start to build up paint further up on the hairs of the liner brush, I'll scrape off the paint on the edge of the palette knife and then re-dip into the paint with just the tip of my brush. I don't load it up all the way up to the ferrule because I don't want them too thick. And the more thin lines that I get, the more liquid I add to the paint to really get it flowing and really get it thin. And it moves a lot easier across the canvas the thinner you get it. Now I'm going back to these mid-ground trees, and I'm doing the same technique that I've done throughout this painting, which is just adding a ton of little dots and establishing all these sorts of little leaves that are popping up on these trees. And by doing all this, I'll start to define the tree's shape. Going back, and I'm adding more limbs and twigs and branches. So now all of the highlights, not the brightest highlights, but I'm starting to establish some highlights onto this tree. And what that is going to do is bring it forward in front of the orange tree that's right behind it. Again, I'm going back to the leaves and painting in those, and because they're getting closer to the viewer, they're going to be bigger. And I'm starting with the brights, and then I'm going to go in and establish the shadows and slowly tone this down at the very end. But I always start with the brights. So I'm taking this liner brush also and going back and forth between a very dark color, almost black, and I am creating the shadows in between all of these leaves. And it's just a bunch of little twirly squiggly lines just to establish pretty much almost where each leaf is. I'm moving on to the upper tree and establishing some more twigs and more shadows in the leaves. The same with down in the foreground, these little trees popping out, they have to have some sort of branch that keeps them all together. The more twigs I start to add, the more alive these trees start to become. I know in most of my videos I talk a lot about value and the importance of it to create a realistic painting. But I also want to let you know that contrast plays a really big role as well. And what contrast pretty much is what the lights are on top of darks, or vice versa. Those can create a lot of focal points and can establish a lot of depth and dynamics into your art. So right here, I have the light shining through all these trees, and it's really making those leaves that are highlighted pop. And I also want to make the foreground a little darker, and I'm doing that by adding all of these darker leaves, the darker road, and all of these shadows. And what that's doing is allowing your eye to come further into the painting and kind of wish that you could see where that road is going. Instead of being stuck right here in the foreground and not being able to have your eye travel throughout the canvas and throughout the painting, I'm making the foreground darker, which is making your eye draw towards the center of the canvas and kind of looking around the bend. So that's pretty important when doing any style painting. Doesn't matter what your medium is that you're working on. Creating the contrast between the lights and the darks can help your eye make a focal point. So right now I'm just going around and I'm defining the rocks that are here, the natural stones in this hill. And because they're still in the shade, I'm not going to put anywhere near a bright white or a bright tan or gray or whatever. They're not going to be bright colors because they're in the shade, but you still need to understand that even things that are in the shade still have a lot of color and depth to them. So I'm going in and I'm doing the tops and sides of these rocks, and I'm kind of just defining them a lot just to help the viewer see that these are still rocks. I'm going into this top tree and I'm adding a lot of leaves to it, and I have my palette knife there that I work on instead of keep going back to the canvas when I do little tiny things. I like to keep my paint really handy. So I'm adding a lot of brights now, especially to these trees because the sun is shining through that road and it's going to be hitting the tops of these trees. And again, that contrast is going to play a role here with those bright highlights, and the underneath growth is going to be a lot darker, which is making these trees stand out a little bit more and bring them closer to the viewer. It's going to be closer to the foreground. Again, I'm just layering on a ton of little leaves still in the ground. You could layer and layer and layer forever. And I want to show that all these little trees that are starting to grow right here on this bank on the right hand side still have some leaves left on them. And it also helps to establish the fact that they're actually trees. Adding some more twigs on some of them and going back and then adding on some leaves just here and there. And some of these that I'm putting leaves on are going to get a little highlights leaves just to show that the sun is still poking through these trees, and it's not only highlighting the ground, but it's also highlighting some of these leaves. Just adding some more texture to this dirt road, just here and there. I want to show that there are a lot of little rocks and indents and everything to this little logging road. So just keep adding texture on top of it. Again, there's some grass that grows through all these leaves. So we got to make sure that we put some grass in there. And there is the finished painting.
So I hope that you all really enjoyed that. If you have, make sure to hit that like button. If you love this style and you want to see some more, make sure to subscribe and don't forget to hit that little bell so you get notified every single time I upload a new video. But the most important thing, make sure to go check out my website at tiffany'sfineart.com, where paintings like this and all my other paintings are available, as well as prints. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you will get notified every time any of my stuff goes on sale, and you can get entered in once a month to get a free print of any one that you choose. So make sure to go check that out. Until next time, guys, bye!